Hi, Gavin. Welcome to Off the Podium.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Very excited to have you. I've known you for like 10 years now, at least.
At least?
I first got to know you as a journalist, as a writer.
Right.
But you have a long history as a musician, as a composer.
Right. I reviewed your orchestra.
Why don't we start actually from the musical perspective, which is you as a composer?
Yeah, I started doing that, I think in 4th grade, right after I started cello lessons. And it had to do with not having enough interesting stuff to play. Because, at your beginning music books, there's not a whole lot. I mean, even with my limited technique, there was more that I wanted to get out of than as far as musical content, as far as anything that I was playing or studying in lessons. There just wasn't all that much, so I figured I could just kind of scribble down some stuff that was more fun and more rewarding for me. I mean, as simplistic, of course, but just it seemed to be a little more enjoyable.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of how it got started. And just imitating in a lot of ways what we were doing in lessons and in elementary school orchestra and things like that.
Yeah.
It was actually a few years later that I started studying with a teacher who used the Suzuki books, and they had actual music in them. And it was kind of traditional technique and kind of Suzuki technique. She wasn't very hardcore about it, but there are actual like Bach and Mozart and Paganini and Beethoven and stuff like that in there. So that really helped. I mean, it was a big jump for me to have actual pieces of music to study rather than exercises or all the stuff that had been in the earlier books. And I think it would probably make a big difference for any musician if you were actually rewarded aesthetically by what you're studying. And it probably, whether you're a student or an adult who's starting out in music, it probably makes a big difference just to have stuff that is rewarding for you.
Yeah.
And I think probably that might be kind of an overlooked aspect of music training is what literature you're actually studying.
Yeah.
What your literature you're actually learning from. And is that, it needs to be an end in itself and not just like a means to a kind of a greater technical proficiency.
You went on to get a DMA in music and switched or took another career, which is journalism. Why journalism?
I had been actually writing for a long time too. I mean, they were all kind of twin interests. When I got to college, undergraduate was Michigan State, and I was studying composition there and conducting. Grad school was University of Cincinnati, the College Conservatory of Music. And that was more, had applied as a conducting major, but had been convinced to talk to some of the composition faculty too, just because I happened to be there and they happened to be there. And they seemed more enthusiastic about what I had done so far. So I said, I guess I'll continue with the composition as far as, just from an academic standpoint. Ended up with an orchestral conducting minor.
I actually didn't even know this. Wow.
Didn't you?
No.
Oh, yeah. All through that time had been writing, a high school newspaper and doing some a little bit in grad school, quite a bit actually at Michigan State. I did quite a lot of classical music writing for that paper as well. So when I came out to Seattle, which was right after I finished my DMA at Cincinnati, 1994, I had been obviously applying for teaching jobs, music teaching jobs, theory composition. That wasn't going anywhere at all. I mean, like literally no interviews or no bites on the line at all. So I figured, I didn't necessarily want to stay in Cincinnati, and I figured that I should probably just live where I wanted to live and see what happened. And I had friends out here who talked me into moving to Seattle. So not long after I got here, I started, I freelanced a little bit for The Stranger and for Seattle Weekly. And, again, this is just kind of a recurring motif, who is more impressed, who wants me more. It ended up being Seattle Weekly, who I seem to be a better fit with. And that's how that started. And, even for a long time, it was not in itself a living.
Yeah.
I freelanced until about 2008 when I finally joined the staff full-time.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of kind of at each of these forks in the road, somebody was impressed and somebody wasn't. And that's
how it works for everyone. With musicians, with just people in general, I guess, there's a love and hate relationship with journalists. because we
Really? I hadn't noticed.
we want them there to review the concerts,
Yeah.
but we want the reviews to be, all positive.
Yeah.
So how do you approach this? Can you be friends with musicians? I mean, I consider us friends, but how do you stay with friends with musicians who then you have to attend their concerts and performances and review?
Well, yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't. I have, for example, I have met a lot of people over the years, and I have, within the composition community and outside in performance community, met people from the Seattle Symphony and people from the Seattle Chamber of Music Study, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, just met a lot of people.
Yeah.
And, you have to approach it a little bit gingerly, but I try to avoid that situation. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'll write a lot about the Seattle Symphony, even though I know, 10% of the players, but if it's an orchestra, it's not quite the same thing as having the same sort of personal relationship that you would if you were writing about a solo recital, which I probably would not do for some people. I mean, and again, insofar as I review anything anymore, because there are so many other ways of covering music, and we've kind of, at least at the Seattle Weekly, not so much at the Times, I think they still do quite a bit of this, but we have been kind of moving away over the years from making the only way that we cover music the morning after concert review.
Oh yeah.
Because there are other things to do. I'll do it for Seattle Opera because a show is still going on. But if I see it on opening night and the review comes on a Wednesday, then the show's still running for 2 weeks and it's useful. It's less useful for a one-off concert. And I think that's the case with, we also are not doing reviews of, for example, pop concerts anymore that are one night only.
Wow.
And that's been kind of the trend, is this sort of thinking in terms of utility for the reader. And there is some utility to reading about what happened at a particular event that is over, but it's less useful than to read a review of something that you can still go to.
Yeah.
At any rate, there's a long way around your question in that, there's just the idea that reviewing is all I do is hasn't been true for quite a while, and there's so many other ways, like I said, to cover music and to do previews and to do shorter pieces and longer pieces and profiles and all this, and so it's less of an issue because it's less, I don't know, I mean, there are other ways to write about music that are less judgy, less evaluative than a review. Mm-hmm. So, all in all, it hasn't been a whole lot of an issue recently.
With the current social media and blogs, many people ask, and I'm sure this has been going on for a couple of decades now, why still have newspapers where everything could be on blogs, and there are bloggers and people write about this? Why should there be a newspaper?
There's,
for those who don't
know. A burgeoning of opinion is a good thing, and a burgeoning of thought about, art in general. I think that's a fine thing. I think there's people who write for newspapers have been vetted, evaluated on some level as to their expertise and knowledge and entertainingness and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which I think is probably tips the scale a little in their favor than the fact that anybody can start a blog, which is, on one hand, like I said, it's a good thing because the more opinion that is out there, the more sharing, the more people that are writing and thinking about art in all kinds of ways, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah. I wanted to know maybe an incident that really changed your perspective on what you do now. Maybe a review that you did, or you were at a concert and it completely kind of changed your perspective on how to approach your current job.
I don't know if there's been any kind of epiphany moment like that, but I think there's been a gradual evolution. Certainly, I think the stuff I was writing 35 years ago at Michigan State is obviously a lot less informed and less interesting and less expressive and less descriptive of what actually happened, and it's just kind of inferior in every way. And, just having done it that long, and, also having read a lot more of writing about music, not only specifically reviewers, but just music historians and all kinds of books. You just kind of absorb all this stuff and kind of it gets refined. Yeah. Reading a lot of Virgil Thompson over the years and a lot of Alex Ross, the New Yorker,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
all kinds of different people. And he is just kind of, I think that rather than, it would be hard to point, off the top of my head about any single moment, but I think it's just a matter of gradual evolution over the years.
Yeah.
And the more you absorb, obviously, the more music you listen to, and the more you try to keep up with what is going on in composition. And I guess, that's what I would say.
Going back to the composition, I was just recently at one of your concerts where they performed your piece. What inspires you to write? Because before the concert started, you said, I was in this moment where I was told that my piece was going to be performed, so I tried to put everything together. Is there inspiration in composing, or do you just find time out of your busy schedule now with all the writing that you do to also write music?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are two paths you can go. You can be asked for a piece or not asked for a piece. And if you are asked for a piece, then, there are parameters you start with, the people you're going to write for, the event that it's going to be part of, et cetera, et cetera. But musical ideas can pop into my head outside of that. I don't want to not follow a path just because someone hasn't asked for a piece. So upshot of that is that I do have kind of a backlog now of chamber music that I've written over the past decade or so that I need to at some point find performers for. So I mean it can come either way, but I don't want to really ever be in the position of not bothering just because I don't have a performance in hand.
It's just great that you find the motivation, whatever it is, to write something that's not going to be performed.
It's still enjoyable as a pastime.
Yeah.
It's still enjoyable as a way to spend an afternoon.
Yeah.
It gives me pleasure to do it. And it's impractical in that, if you think of, obviously, 18th century composers like Bach and Mozart who had constantly these practical needs to fulfill, making money or making a living or as part of their job, or they're writing for subscription or they're writing for a concert or for publication. There's always some kind of need, and they had very little time just to write for the heck of it. That's obviously the economics of the business has changed. But I don't want to, I hope I never say, oh, that's a nice idea, but who cares? There's nothing I can do with it, no one will play it.
Yeah.
If it's a nice idea, I need to sit down and make something out of it.
Yeah. So going to all these concerts, maybe Seattle or just in the States in general, what are some young composers? Is there really a unique future for the world of composition? And if you know names, if you want to share some names, whether older generation or younger generation, it'll be great to hear from you about that.
Oh, I think the big change in recent decades is that composers are less self-conscious about pigeonholing themselves stylistically. They're less self-conscious about, I can't do this, I can't do that, which I think is the best thing that could have happened after a large swath of the 20th century in which composers were very much self-conscious of that sort of thing. And I think to the detriment of art, there are decades of music in the middle of the 20th century that is still not all that often heard or popular or well-liked. And I think it's probably not so much a matter of that music being difficult to listen to or, 12-tone or it's dissonant or it's serial or blah, 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 let's do this, do that. I think that my guess is that some of what has turned people off about a lot of that mid-century repertory is, again, this level of self-consciousness and the lack of freedom that you can sense when you listen to the music. I think it has maybe something to do with the thorniness of the musical language or the unapproachability of the musical surface, but I think it also has a lot to do with a listener being able to sense that a composer felt really constricted when he or she had written this piece. Oh, wow. That they felt constrained by peer pressure or the march of history or however you want to look at it. And I think that people have picked up on that, and I think that's been a barrier to appreciation of a lot of music that was written in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And I think since then, the tide has started to turn, and people are just not so concerned about that sort of thing anymore. I mean, obviously, drawing in all kinds of eclectic influences from world musics and vernacular music of all kind, and pop and rock, etc., etc., etc. I mean, I think that gives listeners a way in if your music has resemblances to music that they already know and appreciate, like pop or rock music or jazz or what have you. But also, I think it has to do with just a greater sense of freedom on the part of composers in recent years, just being less self-conscious about what they do, less self-censoring. I don't know, I may be projecting just because that's such an important part of my own aesthetic, is to not be that way, not be looking over your shoulder, and to not be thinking of in terms of what you can and can't do as far as picking out sounds and putting them together. So I would say, just to give a very broad answer to your question, I think that there's a lot to be excited about in contemporary music. Classical, which obviously, for many reasons, is not a very good term, but call it what you will, concert music or formal music or what have you. I think there's a lot to be excited about just because composers are feeling more free to be themselves.
Yeah. And a question that I ask, because I go to a lot of these concerts in the Seattle area, and I did as well when I lived in LA, but one thing that always frustrates me or bothers me is that I go to these concerts and they're very well organized, a lot of good musicians, good composers, new composers, just great performances, and the halls are just half empty or just not well attended. Are we doing something wrong as musicians, or are we just not expressing what the concert music or classical music is offering to the audiences for them not to attend the concerts? I mean, what are we doing wrong?
Well, my first thought is maybe you're in the wrong hall. Maybe you're not in a venue that can make your music work its magic. Maybe you shouldn't be in Benaroya. Maybe you should be in a church. Maybe you should be in someone's living room. And people are doing that, obviously. They're doing... Well, you had your concert in that cafe on Capitol Hill, which was a very nice venue. So, I mean, that's my first thought. But, you know, if you start from that perspective and say, oh, half the seats are empty, well, maybe you should be in a hall that's half as big, and you wouldn't have that problem. The larger problem, obviously, is how to get people to give you a try. And that's something that everybody's been thinking about for years and years and years now. You know, what do? There's so much more to compete with. Music is so much more accessible. You can listen to practically anything that's ever been recorded on YouTube. I mean, to say nothing of iTunes or Spotify, the rest of these, there are 500 cable channels. There's the entire universe of the internet, and it's all distraction, and it's all something that you have to compete with. Just in terms of persuading people to spend their time, you know, their limited entertainment time. Do you go to your concert, or do you go to some other concert, or do you stay home and surf the net, or do you read, or do you go to a movie, or do you watch TV? What do you do?
Too many options.
Too many, very many options. And so, I mean, that's a challenge that we've never had to encounter to this extent. It's just been growing and growing and growing, obviously, over the past century. You have to, just the nature of very simply having to compete for people's time, and to a certain extent for their disposable income as well. And for that reason, I would discourage people from being too despairing about it, because that's an unprecedented situation. I've been reading for all my life about, quote, the death of classical music.
Unquote. And that's what I was going to ask about.
And, and Alex Ross, again, to mention him again, points out that the death of classical music is its longest tradition. It has never... People have never not been complaining about the death of classical music. When the first composer in the year 1000 added an accompanying voice to a piece of Gregorian chant, there were polemics about how this is ruining the art. We have new problems to contend with today, to battle against today. But I think that if you're worried about how to actually attract people's attention to what you are doing, on the other hand, though, I mean, what has the burgeoning of the internet and of social media done? it's created an immense amount of distraction, but it's also created a lot of pathways for people to advertise themselves. You didn't have Facebook 15 years ago. You couldn't blog. I mean, we were talking earlier about blogging, which is not just necessarily a matter of writing about music or criticism, but also just of having your band on a web page. It's just the flip side of the increased competition is increased accessibility. And, people have been working on that as well and trying to make it work to their advantage to counteract the fact that it works to their disadvantage.
Yeah. So you mentioned iTunes. If we were to open your iTunes right now, what are the last 5 things you've listened to, or what do you think you listened to, the last 5 pieces, whether they're classical or not?
Oh, well, I listen to music a lot here at work. And what was I listening to? There was a little bit of a Saint-Saëns symphony, and there was some Neil Diamond, and there was some Traveling Wilburys, and there was Gigi D'Agostino, who was a European kind of dance pop. And I was listening today also to some Beethoven and Mozart, and, well, I mean, there you go. It's just sitting at your desk and clicking on stuff that you want to hear while you're doing data entry.
Yeah. I can't not ask about this. The Jeopardy. How did you end up there? And you did so well. You were there for a couple of episodes,
Yeah, I was on Jeopardy about a year ago. Yeah. It was July 12, 13, 14, and 17, actually. Which, I'd been obsessed with game shows as a kid. And I had literally wanted to be on Jeopardy for 45 years. Yeah. And, I won't say it's easy to get them, but the process is pretty straightforward. They have the online test every year. Often it had been in January, but I think one recent year was in October, and I haven't heard that they've done one very recently. I don't know when they're doing the next one. But if you go to jeopardy.com and sign up and blah, 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 then you'll get a notice about when their next online test is coming. And then you just sit and take it. And it's just a 50-question test, which I had taken every year. Then from that, if you do well enough, and I think the cutoff, I've heard the cutoff, though nobody will confirm this, I've heard that the cutoff is if you get 35 questions out of 50 right. Then they put your name in the hat, and then they draw you, as far as I know, at random to come to an audition. Wow. And I had auditioned in 2011, and then auditioned again in 2016, got invited, and both of those were in Seattle. And then, if they like you in the audition, you take another written test, and you play a little bit of a practice game, and you meet the producers and try to not be boring. And then, I don't know, again, it could be random, or probably it's not random at this point because they've actually had some interview time with you. And they probably want to they do end up with just about half and half men and women. So that is probably deliberate on their part. I don't know, I haven't seen any ethnic breakdowns, so goodness knows how that works, or if that is an issue at all. I really don't know. Then, after you audition, you just sit around and wait for them to call you again. And they say that you could be about 18 months, up to 18 months after your audition that you might possibly be called. And I was called a year later. And then they call you about a month before you're taping, and they tape about 2.5 months before you air. And that was that. So it's kind of a long process. But yeah, it was literally the funnest thing I've ever done.
Any other ones you're working towards, getting to? Maybe Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
No. I hadn't thought of that. I think I'm retiring from the field. I think that was a peak experience that is not going to be
a few more questions.
Duplicated.
You mentioned ethnic and minorities, and particularly about the game show that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. Now, in classical music, that's been a big topic, mm-hmm. and maybe about 10 or 15 years it's been on and off a little bit, but now it's really a big topic in class. Mm-hmm. I meet so many amazing musicians and so many people who are just, I would never think that they discriminate and all this, but then the outcomes of programming, the outcomes of the concerts that happen, and the amount of women and minorities in general that are programmed or invited as guest soloists, etc., is still not showing as much.
You don't think it accurately reflects
the people that I meet that are so passionate about it?
Mm-hmm.
So, what's your take? Has it changed? You're a little bit older than me. You've seen a lot more. Is it really growing? Is it a lot better than what it was before?
Well, I think it would have to be better. I mean, the thing that is really hard to gauge is the attitudes of the people who are making these decisions. Because, 50 years ago, certainly 100 years ago, but even 50 years ago, or even more recently, it was the discrimination against women certainly as far as conducting, as far as composition, as far as getting faculty appointments, as far as being admitted to universities in the first place. I mean, it was often pretty blatant. They just openly admitted that they weren't interested in women composers and they weren't interested in women conductors. The fact that it is happening more and the fact that this open discrimination is less blatant doesn't necessarily suggest that these attitudes don't still exist among people. And it's hard to gauge how people's hearts and minds have really been changed. Yeah. I mean, there must be to a certain extent, just because people die off, to be frank. But, that's something that's a big question mark, is you never can know. You never can know about the motives of the people who are hiring or accepting students at universities, or hiring soloists for orchestras, or accepting people into orchestras, or, any of this kind of opportunity in which there is a gatekeeper involved. It's hard to know what they're thinking and what their motives are, and it seems pretty clear that the audiences would be a lot happier if there was more representation of women or people of color. Yeah. And, they have to be looking at that just because it affects their box office, which is kind of a cynical way of looking at it. But, it all plays into this kind of changing attitude and this kind of changing atmosphere. And, talking in terms certainly as far as some of the sexual harassment charges that have popped up in classical music just this summer alone, the way that the hashtag #MeToo movement has kind of exposed now, kind of started in the film industry, and it's really played a big part even in some very, very high profile dismissals of some of these gatekeepers and some of these these men specifically who have held power in these classical music institutions. And it's just been a kind of explosion recently. And, that all ties into it, just the idea that there needs to be kind of a greater level of representation, or, the idea that the personnel of an orchestra or the repertory of a concert season should be more representative of the actual demographic makeup of the country. I mean, it's a difficult issue because on the one side, you have the audience members who would be drawn to a classical concert if it looked more like them. On the other hand, you have the classical audience members who are really primarily interested in the canon. And, often they're the ones who are not only buying the tickets, but donating too. And it has been, and it's going to continue to be, tricky to balance these two needs, I think.
In classical music world, for the minorities, speaking from my background, it's a tough place. It's like figure skating or something. You need money to get some, because for conducting, let's say to participate in some of these master classes, $3,000-$4,000 plus you have to fly there, plus you have to get a hotel. It's not easy to do for someone who doesn't have the finances.
No, it isn't.
And then those conductors who can take on those opportunities end up using some of those experiences on their resume, and then in turn getting certain jobs, and so this continued cycle where it's looking at some of the master classes for conducting and in general. It's just the fees are just enormous. I mean, ridiculous. I don't see how some minorities who are already struggling to kind of make a living and have food to eat would be able to afford those luxuries.
I can't imagine having to.
It's a tough place, and education and funding education more. I think is important, or finding ways to help out. I know there are amazing foundations and scholarship opportunities, but it's just still not enough. And hopefully that will change at some point as well. I was going to ask you about music education. You have 3 degrees, or maybe more. But if you were the dean of the conservatory, one of the conservatories you were at, what would you change in the program to make it more of a 21st century program, if anything?
That's a really good question. I think there's been a movement I've heard. I mean, I haven't been really connected with academia for a long time now. Not really intimately connected. I think there's kind of a movement to helping students prepare for a career, part of the curriculum. You know, alongside with learning theory and history, you have to learn how to manage yourself and how to put on a concert. And I think that is actually becoming part of what you do when you're at a conservatory. How to promote yourself, and just all the kinds of nuts and bolts of how to put on a concert and how to do all this kind of stuff. And I think that's definitely a step in the right direction. Well, I mean, technology is kind of a thing that young people tend to pick up on their own.
Yeah.
But if you added studio work to the curriculum, see, I didn't get any of that, and I have no experience in a music studio, no experience in a recording studio at all, no experience and no know-how, which is, if I had had it, probably it would have been beneficial in a lot of ways. But to add that to the curriculum too, I think probably would be a good thing. I don't know, it's hard to say. I mean, obviously we can talk about the idea of ethnic and sexual representation, again, among the faculty, among the student body. I don't have any clue about how you broaden your pool of applicants, though.
Yeah. That's tough.
Yeah.
That's tough. And actually, I was speaking to Martin Bresnik, who's a composition professor at Yale University, and he mentioned the same thing, that the applicant pool is just...
What do you do if you get 25 men and 3 women?
That's exactly what he said. The numbers might have even been close to that. Did you hear my interview?
Oh, no, that one I did. I haven't listened to it. But yeah, I mean, that... Yeah, and you can have the best intentions in the world, but you can't go out and pull women off the street and make them be composers.
Yeah.
You know, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. But, you know, it starts in public education. And to make sure that students starting in kindergarten have similar opportunities to explore their nascent creativity. And, you know, if we have to focus on that, and then 15 years down the road, we'll start to see change in the number of women, the number of ethnic minorities, and, you know, the number of economically disadvantaged people, too.
Yeah, exactly.
Who are of whatever race or sex, who are drawn to explore the world of music and to let their own creativity out. Yeah. You probably have to start really young and make sure they all have an equality of opportunity before you can even think of getting an equality of outcome.
One of my favorite questions is the hobby question, but I know your hobby. You're a big fan of the Seattle Sounders.
Yes.
And it's really crazy because you're such a big fan. You know all the players and all the stuff, and you're always at the games, always at the home games, and sometimes even the away games. But an interesting thing was about 3 weeks ago we were chatting on Facebook, I think, and I said, "Do you even think the Sounders have a chance?" They were in like 14th place or something, and you said, "Yeah, they have a big."
They always have a chance.
And but you were so passionate about it. It almost felt like you knew there was something going to happen. And over the past like 3 or 4 weeks, they've really turned it around. They're in like 8th place now, I think, or really
8th in the West.
You know, they've really gotten up there.
But they're on the upward swing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
so I was really impressed.
Well, part of it is just I'm an eternal optimist. And my fanhood is really something closer to worship. They just can do no wrong. They can do no wrong. And, you know, in the past couple of years, the same thing has happened.
Yeah.
They started out slow, and both in 2016 and 2017, they started out slow and ended up going to the Cup final. Yeah. This is just kind of what they do. Yeah. And it can be very frustrating in March and April when they're not winning anything at all. But, yeah, I mean, that's just kind of what happened. And, you know, you also have to take it into account that there have been a lot of injuries this year. And there have been players gone for the World Cup. And there are reasons that, you know, they have been struggling. Reasons, tangible reasons that you can point to. So that's one reason to be optimistic, is because, you know, okay, yes, Jordan Morris is out for the entire season, and that's going to make a difference. And there's only so much you can despair about that. when, there's nothing you can do about it. It's not because the team sucks. It's just because these things are happening. These actual real things are happening to the team that are keeping them from reaching their full potential, which I always knew they would.
Yeah.
And that now they are.
It's amazing. You talk so passionately about three different things. It's fascinating. Music, your work here at Seattle Weekly and journalism, writing, and
Jeopardy.
also and Jeopardy, and also the Seattle Sounders. It's amazing.
No, soccer I came new to. Didn't pay a whole lot of attention, or practically none actually, to sports until 2009 when the Sounders joined Major League Soccer.
Oh wow!
And my partner and I got season tickets because. Long story, but we were able to afford it that fall, just kind of by a fluke. And he said, the Sounders are becoming a professional team next year. We should go to some games. We should get season tickets. And I said, okay, sure. So I just thought I'd give it a try, and it would be just a fun thing to do. And, you go to a couple of games, and you get sucked in. Yeah. Really get sucked in.
Yeah.
And, now it's kind of borderline obsessive.
Amazing. Anything that we missed that you wanna say?
No, we covered a lot of bases. We did. That's good.
It was absolutely great to hear you. I could just listen to you for hours. You speak so passionately.
Thank you.
You speak so passionately. That's what I love. And this is one of the reasons why I do this is because I want artists and musicians to come on and just kind of have a free form chat. Nothing too formal or fancy.
Well, that's what that's why I so value my position with the Weekly, is because I have a platform to do this. Yeah. And because the whole point, again, going back to the idea of there being other ways to cover music than reviewing, writing about something after the fact is one way to share your excitement about it.
Yeah.
You can describe what happened and point out what didn't work so well and what did work so well, but it's all stems from the same desire to share this with people and share this enthusiasm with people. Yeah. And whether it's a positive or a negative write-up of anything, I think it all comes from just the desire to proselytize and to say, this stuff is important. This stuff is worth your attention. Yeah. It's worth talking about. It's worth even getting angry about sometimes when you get angry, when I get angry. And it's just, it's worth it. It's worth your attention. And it's worth my attention. It's certainly worth all the time that I have spent doing it and talking about it. And I just want to get other people, insofar as I can, to use this platform to get other people to get as excited about it, because I just think that it deserves the attention. I think that music in general, classical music in particular, it just deserves attention. I don't know how else to put it. I keep repeating the same thing over and over again.
And we need more people like you to be so passionate about it in all different ways. For that energy to go out into the world and bring people in and spread the
well, and again, even if I go to a Seattle Opera performance that I think is stupid in a lot of ways, and if you can start a conversation, writing in a newspaper, it's really a one-way kind of deal. My opinion goes out, and we don't get a whole lot of feedback. If you're on the internet and you have a comment section, you get a little bit more feedback. Yeah. But it's not as good. What is the ideal is that people are arguing about this stuff among themselves. Yeah. And if I can be, even in a negative review, be a catalyst for people to explore what they thought about this. Yeah. Did you think it was also stupid? Did you like it? Did it work for you? Why did it work for you? Yeah. And I think that's the point, is to start a conversation, not to finish a conversation, certainly not to be the last word, which has never been anything that I've been interested in, because that's, when you're the last word, that's where it stops. Yeah. And the continuation of, as you say, of putting your energy out there it's counterproductive to think of yourself as, handing down a judgment on a stone tablet. That is not going to get anybody else excited about what you were writing about or talking about or what you heard. Yeah. That's what I think.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Okay.
Thank you, Gavin.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
We'll do this again at some point.
That would be great.